Okay. It is Tuesday, June 6th, and it's Free Hands Friday number 96. Gene here.
Rob here.
Hey, Rob. We are getting
into... And you see my grin.
We're going to let Rob off the leash for today.
Oh. It is a very special day. This is the day I've been waiting for, and I'm going to assume you've all been waiting for. This is where it gets weird and techy and wonderful. So, our previous episode, number 95, the first session with the K-Mix, I alluded to several very cool things that were coming. And it's been a long wait, but very cool things are coming. And on that note, my stick arrives tomorrow. Back to the show.
That's even better.
So,
the stick wait ends.
Yes. It was only a month and a half. That's what the benefit of buying used. So, and used from Stick Enterprises, so it's been reconditioned, not just used from some guy.
It makes all the difference. Like Emmett was the last person to touch it.
Mm-hmm.
Bam.
So, anyway, today's show, the super cool concept to be discussed today, I will leave you in suspense no longer. It is using the K-Mix, seen being petted. It is the K-Mix as the heart of one's stick rig. Now, most of what I'm going to talk about is not specific to the stick, because the heart of all this is using the K-Mix to run your pedal board and also control your pedal board. And so this gets very, very cool very quickly. But allow me to start at the beginning. And because this is Free Hands Friday, I'm going to assume you're using a stick, because if you're not, you should be, right? So,
is that wrong?
Can you tell? Can you tell I'm pumped? I love this stuff. Okay. So, using your stick, if your stick's made out of wood, then you go into input 1 or input 2 with your TS or TRS quarter-inch cables. It depends on whether you're going to go dual mono or both, basically summed mono.
And can I show what that looks like, Rob, really quickly? Because I'm doing exactly that. So, you'll see here on number 2, I'm just going TRS in, which means I'm getting both the melody and the bass side in channel 1. And
yeah,
you can also run into channels 1 and 2. And I believe that the reason I was getting such low input signals on channels 3 and 4, which are the quarter-inch inputs, which don't have the phantom power, was because of the input trim. So
yeah.
So real quick, just like K-Mix, because I'm gonna. As we do this and Rob gets super excited about stuff, I want to talk about all the stuff that I failed at in trying to set this up and actually make this happen. So you'll see here, there's this input trim. And sometimes it doesn't always register. I've got it set very low for the Chapman stick. Now, in the case of what we're doing today, just to talk really quickly about this configuration, and then we're going to talk about the future, is that I've got channel 2 set to phantom power, so that we have a nice hot signal in the mic. We've checked that earlier. And then I've got channel 2 set very low right now, but if I had that set right there, we'd hear my stick. Actually, I've got it turned off, so we wouldn't hear it actually. But if it was plugged in, we would hear that. And then the last thing, I think, that was it, Rob. I just wanted to talk really quickly about how we set it up here. So we've got it. Let's say we've got it plugged in. Let's say we've got it plugged in with just the TRS cable like we're running it right now.
Okay. Well, actually, for the purposes of this discussion, separate connections, dual mono is what we want.
Very good.
But let me say this about that. The K-Mix has balanced quarter-inch inputs. So it's not really a stereo cable in terms of wiring. It's balanced. But for some reason that is not mentioned in the manual, because the manual goes out of its way to be very kind and gentle, for some reason, that balanced TRS wiring sums mono on a normal stereo patch cable like it's coming out of Gene's stick. That's great. It's good to know. You may have heard it here first, quite possibly. But I don't know why it works. So if with a dual mono arrangement, if your stick's made out of wood, you go into the 1 and 2 and adjust your input trim accordingly. If you've got a rail board, you can do that, or you can go XLR, turn on phantom power on 1 and 2. Now you've got active mode. And oh, by the way, it's XLR, so your noise rejection and everything is super groovy.
Right.
And for that matter, active mode lowers your noise floor and all those other good things. Plus, it sounds awesome. Oh, God, my railboard sounded amazing in active mode. With guitar, I'm passionate about passive pickup, but I never used my railboard passive, not once. It sounded so good active. Anyway, so that's how you connect your stick to the K-Mix. Regardless of whether you're doing XLR or quarter inch, you're going to want it on 1 and 2. 1 and 2 have sort of a preferential treatment in terms of input levels and stuff like that. It's sort of your go-to for mics or instruments or anything that's lower output. So once you've gotten into channels 1 and 2, this is where the really fun part stops. Because all those other ins and outs, they become available for your effects routing and your effects handling. Now, before I get really into that, I got to mention that, remember, in the K-Mix, you've got DSP that the channels go into. And, you've got per channel, you've got a high-pass filter that cuts everything below 40 hertz. And I think that's second order 12 dB per octave, but it might be first order 6 dB per octave. Whatever, it's below 40, it's in the manual, yay rah. So you've got gain control, you've got EQ that can be bypassed, you've got a compressor that can be bypassed, you've got a gate that can be bypassed per channel. So that means you can EQ the melody side and the bass side separately, set the high-pass filter on the melody side. Personally, I'd leave it off the bass side because, I'm all about lows. Gotcha. But on the melody side, that can help prevent crosstalk, right, in the pickup module.
Right.
So you can set all that up. At this point, the K-Mix is your preamp. And if you were just going to run into some powered speakers or a power amp into speakers, from this point forward, you could. But the cool part is all the stuff you can do with effects. So we're going to pretend you went into 1 and 2, you set up your EQ and compressor however you like, and you're ready to deal with effects. So you can use the outputs and the inputs effectively as buses for your effects pedals. And to help you wrap your head around this, consider that, first of all, you can choose where channel 1 and channel 2 go in terms of which bus you're sending to.
Right.
So that you can have separate effects chains if you want to.
And let's look at that. Let's look at that really quickly. So, and probably while we're talking at some point here, I will go get my TRS to dual mono, and we'll plug into channels probably 7 and 8, and we'll look at how to affect them differently. Because if you've got channels 1 and 2, or let's say 7 and 8, let's say 7 and 8 right now. So we can set our level on channel 7 here, and just by clicking that 7, it then shows you how your EQ is set up. And so you can set up, let's say, your bass side the way you like it, right? And all of this can be done using the pad here, right? You'll see that that I'm able to do the same thing here, but what there is there's also kind of a shift functionality that you have to press. So you'll have to press shift here to then move this other fader. Whereas if you're just doing it in the editor, it's just so much easier because you're just using the bloody mouse to do so. So there's kind of a benefit of using the editor. So then when you come over to channel 7, or channel 8 rather, which is where you want your melody side, maybe you've got a little bit less compression, and maybe by this point you've turned on some reverb, and you can see this would be channel 8. So you can turn that up, and if you can hear me, or I can add reverb to what we're doing right now, because this is on channel 2. So you hear more reverb, right? And so imagine that's a Chapman stick, or a guitar, or a bass, or whatever, and then you can adjust that level the way you want it. Come back into the channel strip here, gate it. If you're and Rob, you'll get into some routing options here, and what I might like to do is try that. So while you're talking, I'm going to kind of hand the conch off back here to you, and then go grab my TRS cable to see if we can get that engaged. Okay.
Well, by the way, thanks for giving me some time to calm down. I'm sure I'll be super hype again in a minute.
Don't calm down. No, I want you. Let's.
Right.
Here we are. You've been waiting for this. So let's. So we were talking about routing, right? So we're talking about kind of inputs and alternate uses for these inputs, right?
Yeah. So you guys with mixer experience or front of house experience, I could get into aux buses and group sends and things like that. Now, the K-Mix doesn't actually have group routing, but group mixing, but that's okay. You could treat it as such. So, if you know mixers, then I've already given away the game. But for those of you going, what in the world does this have to do with my pedal board? Allow me to give you some practical examples. So as you're choosing, let's say that channel 1 is your melody side. It's going to use channel 3 to send, that is to say, output 3 to output to your pedals. Or that's right. The outputs and the inputs don't share numbering, so you're free to use output 1 if you want. But just bear with me. So you're going to take your melody side in input 1. You're going to send it out output 1. What's it going to go to first? Well, personally, I mean, you could use drive pedals, but let's just assume that you're going to play clean. You don't want to mess with the drive sound. You don't want to mess with the fuzz sound. Mm-hmm. So we don't get into a whole bunch of EQ discussion. Gotcha. Let's say that you're going to go into what's a chorus, right? It's the 80s all over again. You're going into a chorus on output 1. Now,
I'm in.
Okay. Now, so right away, if I say the chorus is modulation, and maybe you're going to go chorus, phaser, or flanger, not all at the same time, but if you're into that, that's cool. Okay. At that point, output 1 becomes your modulation section, right?
Right.
Then you come back into output 1 becomes your modulation section, comes back into input 3.
Gotcha.
Now, that means track 3 is the post control for your modulation pedals. You can EQ them, you can set the compressor, you can set the gate, you can set the levels, you can set the send to the reverb, right? Mm-hmm. Because maybe on occasion you'd like to send a little bit of the chorus to the reverb.
Yeah. Okay.
You can do that.
So okay. I remember Greg saying to me, we were talking about the step about, but he's saying, do EQ first. And I never really thought that through, but as I'm listening to that with the K-Mix now, you can put your pedal, each individual pedal, specifically where you want it in your mix. You can have pre-chorus or pre-EQ chorus, post-EQ phase with reverb on all of that.
And you can also have post-flanger EQ if you so choose.
Okay.
It's a mixer with a lot of DSP in it. Have fun, right? Explore. So when I said that's your modulation section, that's the first way you could group pedals. Mm-hmm. That's grouping by function. Now that's pretty logical for figuring out, okay, what's my track 3, what's on output 1, mm-hmm. right? But it doesn't really make the most of the DSP. Because the DSP is about handling audio. It doesn't care what the name of the pedal is. It cares about what the sound is. Okay. So the second concept, that's a little bit more abstract until you think about it, is grouping by sound, right? So if you have, let's go to overdrive pedals, for example.
Okay.
You could you could go into overdrive pedals on output 1, take their output into track 3. Now your EQ is affecting your drive pedals. So let's say you love your drive pedals, but they all have this nasty, raspy high end that sounds like a tube amp with the preamp gain high and the master real low, and it's just bees in a can. And they all do that. You love them, but they all do that. So they all come in track 3. You go into your DSP, you set your EQ, and you tweak it until the bees in the can disappear. Boom! You've just solved all your EQ pedals on one track.
That is nice.
And also, you can make sure that track doesn't send to the reverb so that you don't have reverb behind your overdrive sound making things sound artificially muddy.
And then just to kind of muddy the waters here, and imagine if you had 4 speakers, and right? So you had 2 in front and then 2 in back, and you only wanted to have your drive coming from the back. If you were sitting in the middle of the room, the experience would be you have the overdrive in the back and the clean sound in front, and then you're playing in stereo, so it truly becomes a quadraphonic experience.
So in the previous episode, we briefly mentioned the fact that the K-Mix is a true surround mixer.
Right.
If you wanted to do that with your stick, first of all, envy your gear budget, but secondly, it's absolutely possible.
Yeah.
Everything I'm talking about would be available in surround sound. And here's the really cool part I should mention. Let's say your pedal isn't stereo. Like, when's the first time or the last time you heard of an overdrive pedal that was a stereo output?
That's
right?
ridiculous.
Like, there are some pedals that just aren't stereo, and there's others that are cheaper if they're mono only. If you've got mono pedals, congratulations, you're going into a mixer. If it's feeding multiple speakers, you can make it stereo.
Mm-hmm.
But more on that in a bit,
Good.
right? So, with output 1 going to modulation pedals, that's grouping by function. More useful is grouping by sound. So if you have...
you could do that with multiple overdrives. I mean, sorry to butt in again, but like imagine you had your overdrive on 1 and like your big fuzz tone on 2. I mean, that would be a whole different level of control, right? I mean,
it gets so much better because you know what you could do? You could take your melody on track 1, your melody side, and then differentially send different amounts to outputs 1 and 2. So now you've got simultaneous overdrive and fuzz, and you're blending them.
Yeah, and that's
on the input side. Then when it comes to the output, right? That's where you set the let's say the overdrive is track 3 or channel 3. The fuzz is channel 4. Then you set the levels independently, so you've got the send differentially, but you've also got the output in the total sound of your instrument to the speakers. Like, everything I'm saying can be done about 100 different ways. Mm-hmm. If you consider where you cut in, what comes before and after the patch point, what DSP functions you're using. Like, this goes basically infinitely deep.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm skimming over the top. You can group by function, you can group by sound. And it may take some study of your equipment and really thinking about what you use in certain songs and how you can shape the sound. Yeah. But if you group by sound, that is the ultimate. Because musical gear is about making music. Music is about sound and timing. And, you know, if you want to mess with timing, that's what, you know, chorus and delay and vibrato and the rest, well, vibrato's pitch. But, you know, you can do that separately. Mm-hmm. So in terms of controlling sound, if you manage things according to the frequencies involved and common emphases. So, for instance, if you're using a fuzz pedal, chances are you don't really care much about 3.5 kilohertz, right? So you can just not do that for the fuzzes. You see what I'm saying? You're operating according to the sound. So you can, so getting back to the managing the pedals, if you think about pedals as buses, either by function or by sound, essentially you have access to 3 buses because you've got
so these guys are right up
output.
Here.
You've got output 1 and 3, 1 through 3, I should say, and you've got channels 3, 4, 5, right? Well, that conspicuously leaves outputs 4 through 6 and tracks 6 through 8 because you also have 3 for the bass side. Remember, we're running dual mono. Mm-hmm. And so everything that applies about grouping by sound and all the rest applies equally. Which means if you want to send as an example, let's say you've got a compressor, right? Mm-hmm. You could EQ after, let's say you're going to do a compressor on the bass side, right? You EQ channel 2 to EQ your bass side of your stick, right? But then on, when you send, you go to the EQ before the send. And you can then choose which frequencies compress more or less by how they're EQ'd prior to the compressor pedal.
Okay, so it's like a poor man's multiband, right? Is that kind of what you're going for?
It's
like
not quite the same as multiband, but it's getting there. It's like halfway to multiband.
At least in the context of what we're doing with the Chapman stick, you've got a full range instrument. You can basically, if you close your eyes, regardless of where the strings line up on the fretboard, you've got more control over your low end and your high end and how much you EQ them and compress them where they become before or after the reverb. So
and so just
even I can understand that.
let's give a brief example there, because so there's the pseudo multi-band compression, which that EQ can only affect the send to the compressor, right? That's not screwing up your instrument sound. That's not screwing with any other pedals, right? You have that option. But also, what's the primary difference between bass distortion pedals and guitar distortion pedals?
I don't know, actually. I mean,
okay,
it's something to do with the frequency, I'm sure.
Bass distortion pedals have a function that leave the lower frequencies alone. Okay. Because if you start to distort the lower frequencies, you lose your definition. You can't hear what the note is anymore. Because remember, the way low frequency works, the way human hearing works, is the fundamental doesn't have to be there at all if the harmonics all the way up are correct. So as you're distorting the harmonics, the fundamental needs to be clear. And as the lower you distort, now nothing's clear in the whole stack. Right?
Makes sense.
That's why bass sound reproduction is so hard. It's not just the energy involved in low frequency reproduction and the woofers you need for the wavelengths and things. It's because the lower you start, the more that harmonic stack has to be perfect. Right? So that's the bass guitar and the kick drum, but it's also the bass guitar and the rhythm guitar, the bass guitar and the lead, all the way up. And so
I can dig it.
Bass distortion. Yeah, so bass distortion pedals leave the bottom alone so that the stack can remain clear, right?
Yeah,
well, so if you're using a guitar distortion pedal, it doesn't do that because it doesn't know the frequency is going to be there. But if you go into you EQ before a distortion pedal, if you high pass filter before a distortion pedal, guess what? You just turned a guitar distortion pedal into a bass distortion pedal.
I see. Okay. Yeah.
And now suddenly you have a lot more choice, not just in terms of sound, but also in terms of price. Because I can name 2 guitar distortion pedals that are $50 brand new. I couldn't do that for bass.
Right. Yeah.
So just embrace all the extra stuff. I realize that there's a lot to a mixer and the K-Mix in particular, but piece by piece, subject by subject, just think distortion pedals, just think flangers. Like piece by piece, realize the depth and realize that it all works for you. None of this is mandatory. This is all bonus.
Yeah.
You already have the K-Mix, you already have the pedals, or maybe you already got a pedal budget. This is all bonus. There's no negative here.
It's whatever you can sell.
Yeah, right. So
it's for me, like whatever you sell, you can use to buy more pedals.
So 3 groups maximum per side. Now, were I dealing with like a guitar head, for instance, I'd go, before the input in the loop, right, and then maybe an extra category for stuff that needs special EQ or whatever, right? But the however you do it, you've got 3 buses per side. I keep saying that, but I mention it because damn near everything we're talking about is infinite. That isn't. Right.
So
3
imagine
is a pretty small number compared to infinite combinations.
This is how I would route it. This is how I would configure my Chapman stick. So here's an example. I would set it up, let's say, on channels 1 and 2. So let's imagine these are channels 1 and 2. And the first thing I would do is I would EQ both sides. Now, right now it's got a pretty flat setting. So just looking at, like, let's say the bass side, you wouldn't need too much of that. And again, like when you're doing this on the K-Mix, if you want to make changes to your comp, it's kind of a different experience. So you can see I'm in comp mode right here, and that when I move these, you can see that moving. But if I want that secondary function, man, like it's like now I have to do this. Anyways, so that being said, I can just turn that off, but I'd compress it on the bass, and I'd set actually a gain as well. I would probably add a small amount of reverb. And then on the melody side, pretty much the same way. I'd probably set a gain or a gate higher here because I'd be going to outboard effects. And Rob Gellner does this. He uses, I think, an effects loop. So he sends it from one of the outputs on this side of the mixer.
Yep.
And you can send it mono, you can send it stereo, and then feed it back in through the inputs, which is just...
yeah, that's what I'm talking about. It's roll your own effects loop.
Right, so you can...
bonus EQ and compressor and gate and all that good stuff.
Exactly, so I would probably have something set up. I would use the internal compressor, and I'd use a probably very basic reverb sound in the right hand, and that would be my total and complete sound through a pair of KF12s. And actually, I did that last weekend... 2 weekends ago, no, 3 weekends ago, my friend Patrick turned 50 years old. So I went up there, and actually, you loved it. I had to use a little power brick to power up the K-Mix, and so I just took like the same cable I used to charge my Android, and that actually provided power for the K-Mix. And then and that just went like, for like 6 hours or something, because his daughter's band was playing, and so it worked out nicely. We ran the bass into that, we ran guitar and vocals into that, and so it worked for like the whole evening. It worked for everything, and I used the internal reverb for the. I used the internal reverb. I didn't loop anything out using the sends and returns, but I was able to use just the onboard reverb. That was enough for the vocals. It worked out really nicely.
It should be noted, by the way, that the K-Mix has a dedicated USB port for power for just that scenario, so that it doesn't even try to do anything other than get power from that USB port.
That's right. And there's the reason it has that other type of connection, which I've seen, and I can't remember the name of it, but I've seen it on like cameras before. It goes USB to that type. It's not like this one.
I think it's.
But it's
a mini USB or micro USB.
I think like a mini USB, and that's exactly what it is. It's a mini USB because I have that on my my disaster area DMC3XL.
There you go.
You can plug that into your iPad. So when it does that, it know that it's sending and receiving MIDI on the mini USB, right? And then it's getting power from the other one. Whereas it can use it for both as well. So the real kind of the upshot to this, and something I haven't done yet, is plug in a tablet to it and get it to work. So,
okay,
tablet budget. Jeez.
Yeah.
Right.
There's you mentioned two things there, and that's actually the next two things I'm going to get to. So in order, you mentioned your K12s. So let's stop for a minute, leaving with for now, and talk in. We've got the DSP providing the preamp and the EQ and compression and whatnot. We've got whatever pedals you're running to. More on that in a moment, trust me.
Okay.
Now we get to the output. So right away, before we get to the speakers, there's master EQ, compressor, and gate, because you've got that on the outputs as well, right? But there's also another point. Remember I said that if you don't have stereo pedals, you can make them stereo? Now, you were talking about using a pair of K12s. So let's talk briefly about more than one speaker. Because if you've got two speakers, right, there's three ways you can run, essentially. You can be hard pan dual mono, melody in one, bass in the other, right? You can involve the effects. One gets the effects, one doesn't. That's a wet-dry mix. That can be very effective. Now, you can also have stereo, and there's a true left and right, and you've got panning. There's no hard separation. You've got melody and bass in each, and it's a stereo mix.
Generally how I run.
If you've got three speakers, you can have wet, dry, wet. So the dry's literally in the middle of whatever the array is, whatever the arrangement is for the space.
Or you can use one as kind of like almost like a subwoofer. You could dedicate that to the bass and then have stereo melody, which is how I would run it.
You could, but that's strictly speaking not a wet, dry, wet.
No, that's
wet,
true.
Dry, wet, everything needs to be equal, and it's the effects that vary.
Okay.
But the reason I lead into it that way, and what you just said actually gets to what I'm about to say, but because this is a mixer, because it has panning control, because it's a stereo mixer with stereo outs. Because remember, the difference between stereo and dual mono is panning,
right?
The ability to control the soundstage. So what you can do with just two speakers is you can take your wet signal and pan it stereo, your dry signal pan it center, and you've got poor man's wet, dry, wet.
And see, what I love about that, Rob, is I think of it as with three speakers anyways. I mean, I'm still going back to that, is running it. I've always wanted to be able to isolate a bass amp, to have a bass amp. So to run one of the outputs to, with my bass amp budget, to a bass amp, like a SVT, whatever it is, just like a little 210 combo or something like that. And then, but also run the melody side and the bass side out to a pair of K12s that are set up more for those high frequencies. And then dial back the bass just a little bit so that the low end isn't competing too much with the melody side. And just this actually gives you the opportunity to do that. You can feed a Chapman stick into channels 1 and 2, right? and then use separate amps here. So you could just run 1 and 2 to run everything, stereo pan, true stereo, and then a dry mix to your bass amp in channel 3.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you could definitely do it that way. You could treat it like what's known as 2.1 mixing. The idea that there's a dedicated like sub feed.
Mm-hmm.
You could do that, but and frankly, I think you could do better than a 210 bass combo for that. But that's not this episode. So
here comes the fearful discussion. Oh my god.
Oh, dude, but there are alternatives. It's just
we're at 27 minutes.
Yeah, as a general distinction, I'll point out that there's a better way. It's been discovered. But,
absolutely.
So in terms of panning back to the pedals, and also just in terms of feeding speakers, whatever's coming after the mixer. Mm-hmm. Remember, you have pan controls. You can do hard separation dual mono. You can do wet dry. You can even fake wet dry wet. Or if you have the speaker budget, you can do true wet dry wet.
Right.
It's not just a stereo output. Remember, this is a surround sound mixer, and if you don't tell it it's in surround sound mode, then you've just got independent outputs. You can feed it whatever you want to in terms of amps and speaker configurations. It's up to you. The mixer doesn't know. It becomes strictly preparation of sound. Right? So, and then let's not forget it's also got USB, which means if you've got a tablet, if you've got a laptop, you can make field recordings. Mm-hmm. And the field recording isn't going to benefit from the wet, dry, wet per se, but let's say you're doing, because that's like the most loss you'd have, because wet, dry, wet is really a spatial effect. Mm-hmm. Let's just say that's the way you were doing it, so you had the most to lose with a field recording. Just record it to separate tracks. It's multi-track. Record it to separate tracks and do the wet, dry, wet mix later. Because that's what the mixer's doing, is it's just feeding it individually, and your speaker placement and panning controls are setting the wet, dry, wet.
Right.
So you can make a field recording, however simple or complex you want it to be, straight off the USB. And the mixer isn't big, the mixer isn't heavy, it isn't particularly loud when it's running, it doesn't need a lot of power, so you'd have a noisy power supply. You could match your recording device, tablet or laptop, to your budget and your size and sound constraints for how quiet the overall rig needs to be. Mm-hmm. And you can make a field recording in real time. And if you need to adjust something for some reason, the K-Mix also controls the field recording because it's true multi-track. Mm-hmm. So, like, you get your field recording for free, essentially, as long as you have a laptop or a tablet already. Nothing about what you're doing has to change because there's a field mix, mm-hmm. which, depending on what you're doing, is hugely beneficial.
Yeah, it's crazy to think. It could all be run from a tablet.
I have my notes here. In my notes here, Greg Howard, Water on the Moon, right? Like, classic example. He was playing for an audience, and he made a field recording, and it became an album. Mm-hmm.
A little bit of Purple Rain was like that. I don't know if you know that. Like, Purple Rain was like a live show. Like, a lot of it was just, like, done live. They were like,
so
we do it live!
Yeah, right? So, we're already at 27 minutes. We're past 27 minutes. So let me get to the special part. Because right now I've said, it's a mixer, and if you think outside the box, you can use it to mix things that you wouldn't normally mix.
Sure.
Here's where the pedal board aspect...
Where the mixer becomes part of the pedal board. Like, relative to the placement of where it falls with all the pedals, it becomes like another pedal. Yeah,
so it's your stick preamp in this scenario, but mm-hmm. it also takes the place of, let's say, a Boss ES5 or ES8, a gig rig, various pedal switching systems. Now, not 100%, but what they don't do, that this absolutely does, is it's a mixer with ESP. Mm-hmm. So it's a trade-off, but there's way more pros in the K-Mix column than there are in the others. Yeah. And when you consider the K-Mix is what, like $580, $550, something like that?
About that.
US dollars?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's more than a Boss ES5, but it's less than a Boss ES8. Mm-hmm. It's well less than a gig rig, not to mention the, what do they call it, the generator power supply, the modular power supply. Like, I'm not going to go into all those, because of course I could, but the point is, you're not even paying more.
Well, you know? it appeals...
It's remarkable.
It appeals to a performer more than it does to someone like who is like a guitar buff that wants a really cool amp, that wants a really nice pedal. It's like, this isn't for you. This is for somebody that actually has a gig like tonight at 7 at a coffee house. And like, you can go plug your guitar into that. You've got your microphone. You've got all that kinds of separation. When you do integrate it into the pedal board, it's just insane to think what you can do with it. Just because for so many reasons, you don't even need an amp. I mean, like, you don't need a guitar amp per se. You're just running through the PA. And that's how I used it the other night. It was just like, what are we going to do with the bass? I'm just like, just give it to me. You know, just run it right here. So easy.
Well, let's say you're a tube diehard like me. Here I reach for my 12AX7 that I keep handy as like a token of good luck, right? Nice. It's dead. I don't worry about it.
It's like, careful with that.
Yeah. So, anyway, let's say you're a tube diehard. There are tube preamp pedals for guitar and bass. You take the output right into the K-Mix, boom, there's your tube preamp. Right. There's your dynamic distortion, etc. That, you know, there's great fuzz pedals, there's great distortion pedals, but they don't do the tube thing. Tubes do the tube thing.
Right.
So the you can work around it as much as you want, not as in like a workaround like a false solution, but surround this with whatever you want, because it's agnostic. Yeah. And it always has more power than you need for routing, for EQ, for compression. You don't need to worry about it, unless you're getting really big.
You could also, if you're doing a lot of looping, and this is something I've been thinking about, is when you're looping and you want to be able to actually have something repeat. You could slather it in reverb, or you could EQ it a funny way, and you could have it on a separate channel. So I'd love to see, I mean, and just what that would look like, you know, because you'd have your dry signal, and I know that once upon a time, Adrian Belew ran 3 volume pedals, and one of his volume pedals controlled his volume, and one of them controlled his delays. And I'm not sure what the third one controlled, probably some sort of synth or who knows what else. But people asked him, why do you have so many volume pedals? And he says, because he's running separate mixes of everything. And this was back in the late 80s, early 90s. So
yeah. And one more thing is, anything you want in terms of output, whatever patch point, whatever, can be your front of house send if you've got PA support. Mm-hmm. Like, in addition to choosing how you're going to route your pedals and what's going to have what EQ and compression and whatever else, you can also choose anywhere in this this system you've developed to send to front of house.
Right. So you can take your outputs and route them the way you want to. Yeah.
And remember, it's a balanced output, so you're not going to gain any noise on the way to the front of house mixer either.
It's wild. It's wild to think of how it would fit into a pedal board. And at some point, you know, maybe we'll hit up Rob Gellner and we'll talk to him about how he's using it, like, you know, in live situations, because he's doing it and it's actually pretty cool. So that would be maybe good for the next one. Now, before we wrap up, we want to make sure that we covered everything, because
yeah. So I was just going to say, before we wrap, I got so excited I didn't get to the last part, which is the coolest part.
Okay.
So you've got your pedals arranged, you've got everything going in and out of the K-Mix, you're all set to feed your speakers however you're going to. This is all very, very good, but you're thinking, where's the part that changes how I use my pedal board? Right? I'm affecting the sound differently, but I'm not using the pedals any differently. This thing does MIDI, right? I've got MIDI pedals. Where's the MIDI part?
And we're going to talk about that. That's going to be a whole dedicated thing, because I have the MIDI converter, so like I can send and receive MIDI from it.
Yeah, so the dedicated thing will be actually showing how it works. But as a brief overview, this thing, the K-Mix supports USB MIDI. You can get that out to normal 5-pin DIN MIDI with a Keith McMillen MIDI expander. Now, I should point out, because I was confused about this for a little while years ago, that is not useful for anything else. It's specific to Keith McMillen, the way he does USB MIDI. You know, he makes the source, he makes the recipient, he controls the system. There are other more expensive things if you need to have a true USB MIDI host that's just a box instead of a computer. Mm-hmm. There's people who make them. I don't need to name any of them. Like, it's a whole segment of the market, but you need to know it's a distinctly different thing. So you take the Keith McMillen MIDI expander. Now this thing can send and receive 5-pin MIDI, right? It has an in and an out. So what you can do is, of course, get a MIDI cable, send to your MIDI pedal. Now, your MIDI pedal's MIDI documentation talks about program change and contiguous change numbers and all the different functions you can control. Well, you can tell the K-Mix what MIDI to send with the certain controls on the top of it, right? So all you do is say, in the preset I'm on the K-Mix, this rotary control is going to send this program change over this MIDI channel. And now let's say that's on your delay pedal. that's your feedback. And you can just move that control in the K-Mix, and that's increasing or decreasing the feedback on your MIDI pedal. It's that simple.
So
but here's another one for you.
It's almost like it becomes an interface for configuring your pedal. So
yeah.
Okay, so here's like one of my little favorite guys right here, my little quadrant. So Alexander pedals, they have a multi-jack. So this jack right here can be used to receive MIDI via TRS. So I might try to do that. See if I can actually use the K-Mix to configure the pedal and then save the setting, which is brilliant. So you could actually use it as an interface, just like you would like if you had something like the Tone Studio for the SY300. We didn't plan this. I didn't even see this coming. So you can program your pedals.
I told you, it's the cool part. It's the cool part.
It's so dope. So you could
let me just. So we already explained how to get kind of stereo out of things that don't have stereo. Now we explained how to get presets out of things that don't necessarily have presets. Because if you store it in a preset on the K-Mix, it's a preset. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter whether your pedal actually supports presets and it needs live MIDI all the time. Mm-hmm. You can send your live MIDI when you switch to the preset, because there's a preset change MIDI send. You're great. But before I get into other cool stuff, let me censor myself, just in case there's kitties. Before I get into other cool stuff, let me say this. You can do that not only for knobs that are on the pedal. You can do that for knobs that aren't on the pedal. Because how many times have you looked into MIDI documentation and you see that there's a hidden function that they just couldn't fit the knob for? Yep. It's this whole great mode that's inside that maybe you can turn it on with a combination of the controls on the top, but you can't adjust something. You have to go into your editor on your computer and save it as a preset or something. What you can do, because you can assign any old MIDI program change to the controls in the K-Mix, is you can say, you know what? I'm going to have on the faders, I'm going to have these knobs that I want to move up and down. Let's say delay, time, and feedback, right? Really easy self-oscillation, right? But furthermore, up on my rotary, I'm going to have the knob that isn't there. I'm going to give myself knobs that don't exist in physical reality. You can do it with MIDI, and so if you have the means to send MIDI via a control surface, you can make a knob that doesn't exist.
That's
if it's
cool.
Also in the thing that's routing your pedals, it's to hand. And you can even get really deep and have a certain range for that control in certain presets based on your routing. You can, all of these things stack. If you're a D&D player or something, the buffs stack, right? If you're a programmer, it's nested, right? It's all recursive. You can do it all for everything.
Yeah.
But here's another thing, though, because this is just so cool. Remember I said it's got a MIDI in as well as a MIDI out?
Right.
The K-Mix can receive MIDI. So let's say that the K-Mix is the heart of your system, but you know what? You don't want to reach over and do stuff to it. Let's say you've got presets set up so that you're changing your pedal routing and your MIDI and all that according to your preset. And you want to have a way to change that, but you don't want to reach over to the mixer. When you take a MIDI switcher like the aforementioned damage control, you connect it to the K-Mix's
disaster
MIDI
area.
in. A disaster area. I getting my D's confused here. At least I didn't say DeLorean, right? So your disaster area, you tell it to send to the K-Mix a MIDI signal that says change to this preset. Now you've got remote control of your presets for routing and EQ and all that kind of stuff. Everything you can preset in the K-Mix. Yeah, so there it is. And it gets even better because you don't have to do it universally as presets if you don't want to. There are MIDI mute commands for the K-Mix. So rather than turn off your pedals if you have them grouped by sound or function, whatever your pedals are grouped as, right? You don't have to reach over and turn them off if you use them as a set. Let's say a certain song has this combination of these two pedals in it. You can just hit your MIDI command to mute where they come into the mixer. Now they're off as far as your sound is concerned, as far as your field recording is concerned.
And that's very valuable to have because I have a mute pedal. I have a dedicated mute pedal on every board that I have. I have a dedicated mute pedal just because stuff gets noisy and I need to get it quiet fast. I need to be able to like shut it off. So, because I can't adjust the volume, right? It's like I can't be doing that with my hand. I need to be able to flip it on with my foot. So that saves you 4.2 inches on your pedalboard.
So here's another example. You can use MIDI to adjust the EQ in the K-Mix. So let's say that you've got a MIDI pedal, and when you engage, let's say it's a Boss DD500, right? The Boss DD500 in its various settings, there's 4-band EQ with parametric low mid and high mid for every setting, which is amazing if you think about it, right? But you can also send MIDI when you load a patch in the DD500. Okay. So if you load a particular patch and you know that you want to have, let's say, a little bit of a mid scoop around, let's call it 550 hertz on your bass side, right? When you're using that patch, you can tell that patch to send the MIDI to cut, to change your EQ on your bass side. And when you switch off that preset, you can, of course, set it back. Like, you're setting up your system. So as long as you remember to have a compensatory change back to whatever you normally use, whenever you hit that delay sound, you're not going to have the mids that screw up the sound.
Right.
You can do that.
And that comes back to good configuration management, good categorization of sounds, and remembering these things and putting together meaningful presets, which is great because we get overwhelmed when we get all these things together all at once. And with the K-Mix, what at least it does for me is allows me to kind of build around it. And so that's worked out really nicely. I really like my Mackie Mix 8, but and the reason that I don't want to use the K-Mix on the board is because I like having the K-Mix on my desktop. It's like, if I have to go back and forth between those two, it could get ugly. So that's why.
But you do have the K-Mix editor and infinite supply of preset storage on your hard drive. So you could connect it to the computer, fetch the preset off the hard drive that sets it up for the computer, and there you go.
I could just lean the pedal board up against the desk, I guess, That's what it's starting to look like.
Yeah. So just real fast, when I was talking about using MIDI to turn off the pedal groups by using the MIDI mute command, that's analogous to a pedal switching unit like a Boss or a gig rig, right? But when I'm talking about adjusting EQ remotely, that's not something they can do. They don't have EQ.
Yeah.
And you can get like a source audio programmable EQ and like set up presets, but that's another pedal. And it's not parametric like the EQ in the K-Mix is. And you can't, that works on a preset basis. You can't, at least I think it does. I don't think you can say this band, up or down this many, but also, of course, because this is parametric EQ in the K-Mix, you can choose the frequency, right? Because the source audio programmable EQ, as great as it is, it's graphic. Its bands are set.
Right.
So pedal switchers can't do this.
Yeah.
You've already got an advantage that pedal switchers don't do. And so here's where the really cool part comes in. You say, well, that's great for presets, but I can't do everything as a preset. Or maybe I want to be able to sweep the mid frequency for the cut and kind of get a pseudo wah-wah effect, right? Well, those of you who know your way around effects are saying, expression pedal!
Right.
Maybe even MIDI expression pedal.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of source audio, the source audio reflex.
Yeah.
MIDI expression pedal. This thing, alongside using a K-Mix to manage your pedal board, right? What this thing allows you to do is, there isn't time to go through everything, so I'm going to give you some meaningful examples, right? What the source audio reflex allows you to do is put any MIDI CC on the treadle as a maximum sweep, so the minimum and maximum, and even the rate of change for the amount of movement, you can set that, right? But you can also have it send, like I say, 3 different MIDI CCs, each with their own sort of scale for the CC. So it's a customized blend of your foot movement for these things you're controlling up to 3 at a time, which means if you put it on the volume of a track or on the master output of the mixer, it could be a volume pedal, but you could have a volume pedal that's like an Adrian Belew blend, or on the overall volume. You could use it to control EQ and get like a pseudo wah pedal like I was talking about. You can do it on the compression and make it into a sustain pedal. Think about that. You can have a freeze control for free. That's one MIDI CC. If you use the other MIDI CC for EQ and panning, now you've got a custom freeze. And remember, this thing will receive MIDI, so it also has presets, so you can change presets for what it does per song.
That's you know, as a bassist and a guitarist and as a stickist, I'm just starting to really wrap my head around MIDI. And this one in particular is the smallest unit that I've seen that does exactly what I want. So I control 3 different pedals. I can control channel change. I can engage them. And also, like, I can control expression. So this is an expression pedal on the side. So I can send expression to 1, 2, or 3 different pedals. Now, it makes those changes simultaneously. And then it also controls tap. It also controls clock. So it also has a setup or a configuration that allows me to tap in tempos. So this thing controls tap, expression, channel changing, turning things on and off on 3 different channels. I can't wait to see how I'm going to integrate this with the K-Mix. Like, if that can be done. Like, and
yeah, it definitely can.
You really? Okay, that's freaking cool. Or use the K-Mix to adjust like the rate or the feedback on things. Not that I need to be able to do things with my feet as a stick player, right? It's just like you need like both your hands are engaged. So like your pedalboard becomes so like quintessential to your sound. So I can't wait to see how, and I have to see if they can be engaged simultaneously where I'm doing MIDI things as well as using it as a mixer as part of my pedalboard. I think that it can.
Okay, so I'm gonna real fast finish this up because we're at almost an hour. We really are almost finished. But it's just so cool.
It's so cool.
So I mentioned we could handle volume, we can handle EQ, we can handle compression, but we can also handle panning. So if you've got multiple speakers, you can pan, you can send up the 3 MIDI if it's panning or panning in addition to, let's say, compression and EQ. Right? You can get very interesting.
Yeah. So imagine you're setting channels 1 and 2 to speakers right in the middle, right there in the front, and that's like your front of the house mix. So it's almost like you could
send it backwards.
Imagine this. You're using these as monitors. This is your monitor, and then like channels 3 and 4 are actually your house mix. I'd probably do the other opposite. Like this would be like 1 and 2 would be the house, right? And the 3 and 4, actually just whatever. 3 and 4 would be your kind of on-stage monitor mix. I mean, that's like, I hadn't even thought of it like that. But you could have front of house and back of house with the same damn mixer, which is crazy.
And so you could, if you really wanted to, you could have like a dedicated preset for the mix if things are getting a little too boomy on like a hollow stage, right? And just hit that preset, move your treadle, hit your preset back. Now what you've done is mimicked what is Line 6 calls it pedal edit mode, right, on the Helix and the Pod series and stuff. You've mimicked pedal edit mode for the mix, because you're using a mixer.
That's wicked.
But it doesn't just have a treadle with up to 3 MIDI CCs, and oh, by the way, up to 3 quarter-inch TRS outs. Now, one of them is a dedicated mode you might not need, so your purposes, it might be 2 outputs, but those analog expression outputs are simultaneous with the MIDI, which means if you went whole hog, you could have this treadle controlling 6 things, more realistically 5 things. It's absolutely tremendous, but it isn't just that. You see, it also has LFOs in it. With waveforms and like a very minor sequencer for like stepping through the waveforms or modulating the waveforms, and that means you can do very cool stuff. And I could go into myriad crazy things you could do with that, but I'll give you a conventional example just to...
I like the conventional examples.
Yeah, just to keep it simple. Are you familiar with an effect called tremolo?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's volume up and down, right? Okay. So you take an LFO in the source audio reflex, you assign it to a MIDI CC that's volume. Now you've got tremolo. You want to change the tremolo rate, move your treadle. That's tremolo for free.
Yeah.
No space, no power,
or just
no dollars.
And more control over it. Control over it. And so
like Stone Deaf Effects has a really cool tremolo that's dual tremolo, but the main claim to fame is like the waveform control. And I think I remember Chase Bliss also does a tremolo where you can change the waveform.
Yeah.
Well, since the source audio has the waveforms in it, that means anything that receives MIDI modulation, right, over MIDI CC, you can provide waveforms. So you can use the K-Mix to provide EQ and compression and gate. You can use the K-Mix to provide panning and pseudo-stereo. You can use the K-Mix to provide presets. If you have the source audio, you can use it to provide waveforms to pretty much anything, as long as it's accessible via MIDI. So if you have a phaser pedal that accepts MIDI, now you can have a phaser with waveform modulation, which, as far as I know, only exists in the Cusack Music Tappa phase, which has been discontinued for a long while.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, that's the only one I know of ever. And so, because this is MIDI, right, you can sync the source audio reflex to tap tempo, the MIDI tempo, including subdivisions.
Wow, that's cool.
So you could modulate your phaser as subdivisions of your delay.
Yeah.
Like, it goes infinitely deep. So the source audio reflex is a specific example of how you could use a MIDI controller to great effect.
Right, and I'm much more familiar with this guy, and they've got a whole like you can use expression as well as the multi-jack out as well as 5-pin MIDI. So the expression. So it's like this. They were like, hey, why don't you try the DMC4? And I was like, it's got a fourth pedal. You can have a dedicated tap button. And I was kind of like, this one does everything. This one does everything. And so I can't wait to see how I can use this in conjunction with the K-Mix. I don't know. But even before I do that, I may just see how I can use the K-Mix to control parameters on pedals.
Now, having said all this, a good way to wind up.
We need to wrap up. It's time.
Yeah. So this may not be the close of the episode per se, but just the closing of this subject. I need to take you through alternative MIDI control surfaces, as you might use with a pedal board that's being managed by a K-Mix. From most complex and weird to most simple.
Got it.
So right away, top of the list, the Keith McMillen 12-step. You could use that with MIDI to control pedals and your K-Mix to tremendous effect.
Yeah, for sure.
As a matter of actual controls that are tactile. It doesn't have like a modulation source like a source audio reflex does. But
well imagine also that they were probably testing with that.
If they weren't, they missed a trick. Because
I do think that was part of part of what makes it so beautiful is it comes back full circle to that type of tool application of it.
So going one step simpler and more conventional than that, we've got what guitarists would typically know as MIDI controllers. The Rocktron MIDI Mate is an example, right? You got foot switches, they send commands. You got some kind of display to tell you what you just sent, right? And that's wholly dependent on presets. All you can do is control presets in a way that hopefully makes sense for what you want to do. That is quite conventional, but still, fairly complex. Then there's dual purpose stuff like pedal switchers that also can have MIDI commands involved in when I hit this switch in this preset, it sends this command. That's the gig rig, that's the Boss ES80, ES5, MS3, that kind of stuff. And so if what you need is a conventional MIDI control, preset control, like the Rocktron MIDI Mate would have, you could combine it with pedal switching and get sort of, you could have the K-Mix inputs and outputs partially fed by the pedal switcher, and they're synchronized via MIDI for who's doing what.
And imagine doing that with looping and with outboard gear like big reverbs and delays. I mean, the possibilities are just mind-boggling.
Pigtronic's Infinity Looper. That's a dual stereo looper.
I have one, and I'm a fan of it. I'm just starting to get around to it. It's a cool pedal.
That takes MIDI. So you know what? We got a MIDI tempo command, right? We can synchronize the looper with the delay with the whomever else.
The pisser about that is that it's MIDI only, and that it has to be the end of the chain. And so that's a pretty special spot. So if you're using pedals, though, that take TRS, then you need that end of line for something like a Neolink that's made by Disaster Area or Alexander Pedals. It's a Neolink, so it takes 5-pin MIDI, and then it'll send 4 outs. So can show you what that looks like really quickly. So this is the Neolink on the bottom of my board, which takes, right there. That's the end of the line for MIDI for me. That's where my MIDI stops. And so actually the DMC3 XL Gen 3 can actually control a fourth MIDI device, which is a looper. And it'll work with, it works really well with the Strymon stuff right out of the gate. So the timeline is really kind of like it's clownfish, kind of an enemy kind of a relationship. Although the Alexander pedals are starting to make this whole Neo series, which is like more compatible with it. Anyways, sounds kind of like an advertisement for it. But it's because the Pigtronics only has MIDI in. That's like a consideration for me.
Yeah, and there are ways to do that because remember, MIDI is, I mean, you are older than MIDI. I'm almost older than MIDI. In fact, I think I am older than MIDI.
Thanks.
I think only the basic prototyping is older than me. But here's what I'm getting at, right? MIDI's been around so long. MIDI's been around so long that you had to actually say the MS in front of the DOS because there was more than one DOS.
Yeah.
MIDI's been around so long that any of those cabling problems you run into, they've been solved in a way that's in the standard. It doesn't break any rules. Somebody makes that box, it's A-okay.
Yeah.
There's a way to do it. I promise you it's been around too long. It was made for people. It was made for people that had modular synths when there wasn't a choice in the matter, right? You know, now modular synths are kind of like a cool throwback, and some would argue they sound better and so forth. But you know what I'm saying? Like, it's optional now. It wasn't optional then. That's why MIDI had to be created. So the last point of this is something that bears special mention. I mentioned the Boss DD500 can send MIDI when you change patches. Well, that's kind of the giveaway because you've got so much room for patches. You could have patches that are just dedicated to the MIDI commands you make available on that bank. Switched banks, there's your other MIDI commands. Like if you only need 2 or 3 at a time, and it's preset based, right? You're not going to go variable without like a separate thing like a source audio reflex, right? If all you need is presets and 2 or 3 at a time, and you're free to bank up and down with your foot to get to the next ones you need, you can do it with a Boss DD500 because it'll send all the MIDI you need.
Yeah.
And there was a very brief time.
Does that send and receive? Does the DD500 send and receive?
I think it's got an in and an out that can be changed to a through. I think that's the way it works.
That's what the SY300 has. It's just like responsible MIDI. Like
it's Boss's big chassis MIDI.
Yeah.
You know the SY300, the MD500, the RV, the DD500, the RV. Is it 500? Whatever.
That makes sense.
Modulation, reverb, delay, and then the synth. They all do it. They're basically the same chassis, and they might even be the same DSP platform, but don't quote me on that. Anyway, if your MIDI needs are light, if you're preset based and you don't need a whole bunch of buttons accessible at once, you may already have a pedal that has the MIDI capabilities. It's not just the Boss DD500, but as an example, because my Stage 2 testing rig for my prototype was a Synergy modular preamp system, and I thought, oh crap, how am I going to have the MIDI to change stuff on this, to change which preamp I'm using and stuff like that, right? And then I found out, I can use my Boss DD500 for this.
To change the channels.
No new spending. And I did. I used my Boss DD500 as a foot controller for a modular preamp system so that I had 2 preamps, 2 channels each. It was basically 4-channel preamp.
Yeah.
It worked. It was simple to do.
It takes a little bit of doing. And for guitarists and bassists that generally just have to turn on an amp, like this type of configuration, it's a different way of thinking, and it's a new way. Like in our lifetime, we'll see, like pedal boards in the size of a pedal. Like you see that in like the Mod Duo, and there's the technology is changing from underneath this. I still enjoy having a pedal, but I do enjoy some configuration, and that's where the K-Mix really shines. Is it can give you just enough and kind of a glimpse into each one of those arenas. And I think that we should close on that. Are there any other things that we're missing from this session on kind of that deeper set of functionality?
Well, I'll just say a few closing thoughts. The first is I'm fairly well known for my emphasis on my love of low frequency sounds. We kind of got into that for a moment in this episode. But where that came from, apart from reggae and all the rest, is you've got the low notes. You might as well be able to use them. Well, similarly, with a stick, you've got two signal paths. And rather than treat that as one unified stereo signal, which you can, right? Treat it like two signal paths. Take that idea and run with it.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh. It's a
running
beautiful
a rig
thing.
like this rig seems complicated, but actually it greatly simplifies having two complete signal chains and relating them one to another, because everybody's equal.
Yep.
The K-Mix doesn't care what's coming in. The K-Mix doesn't care what's going out. You have the same controls on all the channels. You learn one thing, you learn everything.
And you can hit the ground running with just a pair of like PA speakers. Like you win. Like you can just plug it in channel 1, channel 2. It's easy enough.
Yeah, you got line level balanced outputs.
Right.
What more do you need?
So what else? What else do we want to hit on?
Well, so the other thing I want to get at is you don't have to get into this all at once. You can take it layer by layer, figure out the MIDI part later, figure out presets later, worry about dynamic control and remote control later. And again, because it's a mixer that functions as an audio interface, if you didn't see the previous episode, feel free to watch that to learn more about the K-Mix itself. All of it, everything we discussed in the previous episode is completely for free. It does that too. So you can get as complicated as you want, as quickly as you want. You can go deeper and deeper and deeper. And this gets me to kind of my final thought. And again, this is something I'm known for. Gear that you can grow into. People think, oh, that's too much for me, or oh, I'm never going to use that, or whatever. But if you spend, again, it's like 580, it's a little less than $600.
Yeah.
You spend a little less than $600 on the K-Mix. You're not going to outgrow this for a while. You're not going to run out of new useful things to do with it for a very good while.
Yeah, agreed.
And, I mean, you can grow into this for years and years, and even when you think you've hit your peak, maybe you saved up enough for a second or third speaker.
Yeah, I like it. It's very versatile. It is very. I think that's kind of what I hear you saying, and we should close on that. It's very versatile. There's really not. There are other products that are like it that I see that are starting to come out, but certainly none as easy to use. And I'm looking forward to seeing more videos on how to learn it and how to use it and how other people are using it. So I suppose what I may do, Rob, is I'll probably do a follow-up. I'll try to dial in a sound just with the Chapman stick for the left and the right side. And I may try to do, and I'll set up the EQ and maybe the reverb and a gate and just something that's kind of like a live sound. And we'll do a live sound test so we can see how it's used. And I'll just use the monitor on my Mac to do that. But we'll do a little 15-minute segment on that perhaps to follow up. And actually, at some point, we'll want to, in our next session, we'll probably, we'll get to see your new stick, yeah?
Oh, for sure.
Cool.
I don't know whether you'll be able to hear it because I don't know whether I'll be able to play it, but hey.
Never stop me. Never stop me. So that being said, I suppose, thanks, Rob, for your time.
Yeah, thanks for your patience. When I have a braingasm, not everyone's good to go along for the ride.
No, we're having a great time. So, and then it'll be fun to see a little feedback from Rob Gallner. Maybe what we'll do is we'll make a point to get him included on one of these next recordings to see how he's using it. So that's how maybe we'll do our closing session is how Stickist actually uses it, and maybe some setups for EQ and how he uses it with his part as part of his pedalboard. Cool. All right, Rob. Well, have a good night, my man.
Yep. See y'all next time.
Sounds good. Cheers.